The lights of the Steve Harvey Show dimmed, but tonight wasn't just another episode. Something different was about to unfold. The presence was coming. Not just a guest, not just a celebrity, but someone carrying more than stories from Hollywood. Someone who had survived darkness and was ready to shine a quiet, sacred light on live television. Steve Harvey smiled as always, charming and full of warmth, walking across the stage. But as the music faded and he looked toward the guest chair, he felt it in his chest. This wasn't going to be a show. This was going to be a revelation. Then he appeared, Keanu Reeves. Quiet, humble. In dark jeans and a plain blazer, his presence didn't scream fame. It whispered something deeper. The crowd applauded wildly. But as Keanu sat down, his eyes found the small crucifix hanging around Steve's neck. And in that single moment, something shifted in the air. "I have something to say," Keanu said softly, almost too quietly. "Something I've never said in public." Steve blinked, the smile fading just slightly. "Go ahead," he said. But before Keanu could speak again, "I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below. We love seeing how far stories travel. And if this already has your heart stirred, subscribe now, because what's about to be revealed might not only change Steve's life, it might just change yours." Keanu leaned in. "There was a moment," he said, "when I almost didn't make it. I was scrolling through my phone, and I found you." Steve froze. The room froze. And that was just the beginning. Keanu's voice didn't carry the weight of performance. It carried the weight of truth. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't for applause. It was raw. And it hit Steve like a wave. "There was a night," Keanu continued, "when I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't find a reason to keep going." The audience had fallen completely silent. No laughter, no whispers, just presence. "I was at my lowest," he said. "And I was scrolling. Just scrolling. Looking for anything to distract myself from the emptiness I felt. And I saw you. Standing on a stage. Talking about pain, about storms, about purpose." Steve's face shifted. He knew exactly the video. It was never meant to go viral. Just a message he recorded after a show when his own life was cracking under the weight of disappointment. "You talked about how God doesn't waste pain," Keanu whispered. "And you were wearing this crucifix. The one you're wearing now." Steve touched it instinctively. And I remember thinking, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. A single tear slid down Steve's cheek. No theatrics. Just truth. "I watched that clip 3 times, Keanu said, his voice cracking. "And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed." He paused. Looked directly at Steve. "You didn't know you were saving someone that night, Steve. But you did." Steve shook his head slowly, disbelief and awe tangling in his throat. "I was just talking, man," he said. "But that's just it," Keanu said. "You weren't trying to inspire anyone. You were just being real. And that realness saved me." The studio was no longer a studio. It was a sanctuary. Steve leaned back in his chair, but not with his usual comfort. His eyes were clouded now by something deeper than surprise. Something sacred. Keanu looked down for a second, then back up. "There's something else I've never said publicly. Not even in interviews. But tonight, I think I'm supposed to say it." Steve gave a small nod, almost afraid to break the moment with words. "I lost my daughter," Keanu said, his voice like a slow breath. "She was stillborn. And just a few weeks later, I lost the woman I loved." Gasps from the audience came like a single inhalation. Sharp, quiet, reverent. "I didn't cry right away," he continued. "Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silence. So deep you forget you're alive." Steve's hand went again to the cross on his chest. "Not for show. For strength. I kept working," Keanu said. "Kept doing interviews. Kept filming movies. Because disappearing behind characters was easier than facing myself." The words weren't polished. They were painful. And that made them holy. "But one night, the silence almost won," he said. "I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I just sat in the dark. scrolling. And then he saw that clip. That simple message. That moment where Steve Harvey, with no script and no spotlight, looked into a camera and talked about how God doesn't forget the broken. I don't know why I stopped scrolling, Keanu admitted. But I did. And I watched. And for the first time in forever, I felt seen. Steve's lips trembled. And I need you to know something, Steve, Keanu whispered. That moment saved me. Let that settle. And while you do, drop a comment below. Have you ever been touched by a message at the right moment? We'd love to hear your story. And if this hit your soul even a little, subscribe now. The most powerful stories are still coming. Steve sat still, hands clasped, heart caught between past and present. For once, he had no punchline, no response. Just a man, facing a truth he never saw coming. You think you're just talking, Keanu said softly. Just hosting. Just surviving. But that night, you were lifting someone who didn't have the strength to stand. Steve blinked, the words landing like stones in still water. He looked toward the audience, and for the first time, it wasn't just a crowd, it was a congregation. I needed to tell you, Keanu continued, because the world knows you as a comedian, a motivator, a host. But that's not the whole truth. Steve met his eyes. Then what is it? He asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Keanu didn't hesitate. You're a minister in disguise. The words cracked the air like thunder. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't clap. They just absorbed. Steve exhaled sharply, the kind of breath you release when you've been holding something in your whole life without realizing it. Do you ever wonder, Keanu said gently, why people are drawn to you? All the time, Steve admitted, his voice thin. It's not your jokes, Keanu said. It's your spirit. You carry something sacred, man. Even when you're not trying to. Steve let out a laugh, short, broken, disbelieving. I'm just trying to make it like everyone else. That's what makes it real, Keanu said. You're not trying to be anything other than who you are. And that's why you reach people you'll never meet. The studio was dead silent, but the emotion was deafening. And I know it's hard, Keanu added, carrying that weight, not knowing if what you do even matters. Steve nodded slowly. But I'm here, Keanu said, living proof that it does. The camera pushed in slowly, capturing two men not as host and guest, but as soul and soul. The world around them, the lights, the audience, the cameras, faded into the background. What remained was a moment that could only be described as divine. Keanu's expression shifted, more serious now. Steve, the way you carry that crucifix, he paused, voice deepening, it's not just a symbol. It's a signal. Steve looked up, confused. What do you mean? Keanu leaned in, his voice low but certain. I've held these words inside me for years. Words that came from you. And tonight, I need to say them back to you. Because I think you may have forgotten how powerful they are. Steve sat completely still, his breath uneven. His hand gently closed over the cross again. Keanu took a long breath, like a man stepping into sacred ground. I remember that clip perfectly. You said something that struck me like lightning. He paused, then continued. You said, God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Steve's lips parted slightly, overwhelmed by the echo of his own words. You said God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. That just surviving might be proof you've been chosen for more. Steve leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, breathing slow, heavy, real. That night your words weren't just sound, Keanu said. They were light. They were grace. They were a hand reaching through the dark to say, you're not done yet. Silence followed. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something too sacred for speech. Keanu smiled gently. And that's the thing about beacons, he said. They don't always know who's watching. They just keep shining. Steve closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, felt seen. Steve opened his eyes, slower now, like waking up from a dream he didn't want to end. His voice came out hoarse. You remembered all that? I needed to, Keanu said simply. Because I wasn't just hearing you, I was being lifted by you. Steve sat back, hands clasped again as if holding onto something invisible. Or maybe just trying not to fall apart. You said something else that night, Keanu continued. And I've carried it with me ever since. Steve leaned in slightly, unsure what was coming, but knowing it mattered. You said, sometimes you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. Steve's lips trembled. The weight of those words hit him like a memory and a prophecy all at once. You think you're just talking, Keanu said. But you're actually testifying. And you have no idea how many people you've saved just by being honest. Steve covered his face with one hand, his chest rising and falling as emotion pushed past the walls he'd built through years of laughter and stage lights. You were the lighthouse, Keanu whispered, when I didn't know which way was home. The audience remained silent, still sacred in their seats. A few wiped their faces. A few clutched their chests. Some sat motionless, as if frozen in a collective prayer. You carried faith into places where people had none left, Keanu said. Including me. Steve's head slowly dropped. Tears fell, not from pain now, but from a kind of recognition. And today, Keanu said softly, I have something to tell you that might change your life. Just like you changed mine. Steve looked up slowly, eyes red but alive, like someone hearing their true name spoken aloud for the first time. Across from him, Keanu sat silent for a moment, calm, composed, but carrying something sacred. There's a sentence, Keanu began, that's lived inside me for years. I've never said it out loud. Not to anyone. Steve leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. Say it. Keanu nodded. God uses his chosen ones, even when they think they're just telling jokes. Steve blinked. His lips parted slightly as the truth of that line cracked something open inside him. You thought you were just entertaining, Keanu said. Just trying to bring people joy. But Steve, you were saving lives. Another tear slid down Steve's cheek, but this one felt different. It wasn't just grief, it was revelation. You saved mine, Keanu said simply. The audience held its breath. Steve leaned back, exhaling part sob, part laugh. I was just trying to make it, man, he said. Trying to get through my pain like everybody else. And that, Keanu replied, is exactly what made it holy. Silence settled again. But not emptiness. Presence. Then something unexpected happened. Steve stood. He didn't speak. He simply reached for the crucifix on his chest, holding it like a compass that had finally pointed home. Keanu stood too. They faced each other, two men with broken pieces, now standing in something whole. And before the next words were spoken, I'll ask you something. Have you ever heard something that changed your life forever? Share it in the comments. And if you believe in real, unscripted truth like this, subscribe now. Because these aren't interviews anymore. They're awakenings. Steve stood, staring at Keanu as if trying to find footing on ground that had just shifted beneath him. His voice came, low and cracked. Why me? It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. A whisper from a man who'd given everything to the world and still wondered if he was enough. Keanu didn't move. He let the question sit in the air. Let it echo through the hearts of everyone watching. Then he answered, because God chooses the unlikely. The audience didn't stir. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. He chooses the overlooked. The ones who've bled quietly behind the curtain. He chooses people who've felt pain, Keanu continued, because they know how to speak to the pain of others. Steve's eyes filled again, but this time there was something behind them, something stronger than sadness. Something like understanding. You're not the loudest, Keanu said. You're not the most polished. You didn't go to seminary. You didn't memorize scripture. But God saw your scars and trusted you with a microphone anyway. Steve's voice came out ragged. But why me, man? Out of everybody he could have used, why would he pick me? Keanu stepped forward. Not with drama. Not with flair. But with reverence. I'll tell you, he said gently. And in that moment, the crowd didn't move. Some wept silently. Others held hands. No one reached for a phone. No one even blinked. Because everyone knew. What Keanu was about to say wasn't just for Steve. It was for them. Steve stood frozen, breath caught halfway between fear and faith. Keanu stepped closer, the studio lights casting a quiet glow around both men. "I'll tell you why God picked you," Keanu said, his voice steady as stone. "Because you've been through it." Steve didn't speak, he couldn't. "You know what it's like to cry in silence," Keanu continued. "To smile on stage while breaking behind the curtain. To ask God in the middle of the night, 'What do you want from me?'" Steve's body swayed slightly, like he'd been hit by a wave of truth. He slowly nodded, almost ashamed. "I've asked him that so many times," he whispered. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough to speak on faith. Not clean enough. Not consistent enough." Keanu smiled, not with amusement but with deep recognition. "And that's exactly why he chose you." Steve looked up, his eyes searching, desperate. "Why?" "Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's," Keanu said. "It sounds like someone who's been through it. Someone who knows what it means to lose. To fight. To question everything, and still get up the next day." The weight of those words didn't just hit Steve, they fell across every soul in the room. "There's people who will never step inside a church," Keanu said, "but they'll watch your show. They'll hear your voice. And through you, they'll hear God." Steve closed his eyes. "And you know the craziest part?" Keanu asked. Steve shook his head slowly. Steve sat back down slowly, his knees weak, not from age, not from fatigue, but from the weight of something invisible, something eternal. His hands folded in his lap, trembling slightly. "I've thought about quitting before," he said quietly. "Walking away from the spotlight. From all of it." Keanu nodded as if he already knew. "I have too," he admitted. "More than once." Their voices no longer echoed across a studio, they resonated through the hearts of everyone watching. "I've wondered," Steve continued, "if any of it actually matters. The jokes. The shows. The grind." Keanu leaned in. "And I'm here to tell you, it does. Every word. Every moment. Every scar you showed the world without knowing it." Steve looked at him, a mix of awe and resistance still tugging at the edges of his doubt. "You really believe we can still have faith in a world like this?" That question didn't just belong to Steve, it belonged to everyone. The hurting, the lost, the tired, the searching. Keanu paused. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew the answer deserved silence before it arrived. Then he spoke. "I believe faith is the only thing that isn't pretending." Steve sat upright, drawn in by the weight of those words. "In Hollywood," Keanu said, "we follow scripts. We rehearse pain. We fake joy. We tell stories designed to make you feel something, even when we don't feel it ourselves." He paused. "But faith," he said, "has no script. No edits. No applause. It's not glamorous. It doesn't win awards. But it saves people. Quietly. Deeply. Forever." Steve's hand found the cross again. "And that," Keanu whispered, "is what you've been doing all along." Steve nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the edge of the crucifix as if it were the last solid thing in a world that had just been turned inside out. His voice cracked. "I didn't grow up with perfect faith." Keanu smiled. "Neither did I." Their eyes met again, not as star and host, but as men who had wrestled with God in the silence. "I didn't grow up in church," Keanu continued. "Didn't memorize scripture. But I've come to believe that faith is real, not because someone preached it to me, but because it met me when everything else left." Steve swallowed hard. "In the silence?" Keanu nodded. "Exactly. It didn't shout. It didn't shine. It whispered. It waited. It sat with me when I couldn't sit with myself." He looked directly at Steve. "And it reached me, through you." Steve blinked, stunned. "Me? Not the polished you. Not the famous you. The broken, honest, still standing you," Keanu said. "The man with a cross on his chest who had the courage to speak life into a stranger through a screen." Then Keanu stood slowly. Steve followed, rising beside him. There were no more cameras. No more audience. Just presence. They stood there, face to face, Two men bonded not by celebrity, but by survival. Then Keanu opened his arms. Steve didn't hesitate. He stepped in. They embraced, not as entertainer and guest, but as brothers. The audience stood too, not to applaud, but to honor. And then Steve turned toward the crowd, his voice shaking but full. "I've had a lot of moments on this stage," he said. "But this was the greatest gift I've ever received." He looked up, his eyes wet but lit with something eternal. "Let's pray." And the room was still. Not because it was silent, but because it had become sacred. A space where something unseen had just happened, and no one dared to speak too soon. Keanu and Steve stepped back from their embrace, eyes glassy, but no longer from grief. From awakening. "I never thought I'd find God in a talk show," Steve said quietly. "You didn't," Keanu replied with a smile. "He was already here, waiting for you to notice." They both chuckled, softly, not out of humor but relief, as if exhaling decades of hidden pain. "You thought you were just making people laugh," Keanu added. "But you were doing more. You were reaching hearts, saving lives, carrying light." Steve looked down at the crucifix again, now trembling in his hand. "And you're telling me that's not just a symbol?" Keanu nodded. "It's a signal. And tonight, I think it's pointing at something bigger than both of us." Steve exhaled, a sound half laugh, half surrender. "And what do I do with that?" Keanu leaned in one last time. "You carry it. Out there. Off stage. Into real life. Because faith doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. That's where it begins. And now I'll turn it to you, the one watching this. Where has your pain led you? Has a stranger's voice ever saved you without knowing it? Tell us in the comments. Your story matters. And if this moment touched your soul, subscribe now. Because what you just witnessed wasn't a performance. It was a divine interruption. "You never asked for this," Keanu said. "You never sought it out. You were just trying to survive. And that is why it's divine." Steve and Keanu sat back down. Not to return to the show, but because they needed grounding. After something holy, you don't run back to routine. You sit with it. Steve's hands rested in his lap now, open. A man no longer guarding his emotions but offering them. "I've always said I'm just a man with a mic," he said softly. Keanu smiled. "And I always thought I was just an actor with a past. Turns out we're both wrong." Steve chuckled lightly. "Feels like we just got called out by heaven itself." There was a pause. Then Steve turned to him with a serious expression. "But what happens now?" "You keep going," Keanu answered. "You speak truth. You carry that cross. And you let people know they're not alone in the silence." Steve nodded slowly. "I guess we never really know the weight of our voice until someone tells us how it saved theirs." Keanu's eyes glistened. "Exactly." The studio lights above them dimmed just a little, casting a glow that made it feel less like a set and more like a chapel. "You said earlier that pain speaks its own language," Steve recalled. "I never realized how many people could understand mine." "They don't need you to be perfect," Keanu said. "They just need you to be real." And for the first time in his long, decorated career, Steve Harvey finally understood the deeper purpose of his platform. Steve looked out at the audience, now no longer an audience but a sea of witnesses. Some were wiping tears. Some were holding each other's hands. Some had their heads bowed, not in shame, but in reverence. "Truth doesn't need to shout," Steve said quietly. "It just needs to be spoken." And then he looked at Keanu. "Thank you for showing me what my words meant to you. I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," Keanu replied. "That's how grace works. It doesn't ask for credit, it just saves." The two men sat in peaceful silence for a moment longer. Then Steve leaned in, his voice softer now. "So what do I do with this moment?" Keanu didn't rush the answer. "You live it. Every day. Not louder. Just deeper." Steve took that in. Then nodded, eyes full of something ancient and new at once. "I can do that." Then he turned back to the cameras. "And to whoever's watching this," he said, "don't wait for a sign from heaven. Sometimes the message is already inside you. You just have to hear it in someone else's voice first." The audience slowly rose to their feet, not in applause, but in witness. Because some stories don't end. They awaken something. And what was awakened here would echo far beyond the show. As the credits began to roll quietly in the background, Steve and Keanu didn't move. They weren't done. Not really. The moment didn't need a finale. It needed continuation. The kind that lives inside you long after the lights go out. I used to think faith was about perfection, Steve said. But now I think maybe it's just about persistence. Keanu nodded. It's about presence. Showing up even when it hurts. The studio was still silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt heavy. It felt whole. Steve stood one more time and looked around, not as a celebrity, but as a vessel. A man who had unknowingly been delivering sermons in the language of laughter his whole life. I'm not a preacher, he said. But I've got a pulpit. Keanu stood beside him. And I'm not a pastor. But I've got a platform. Together, they walked toward the edge of the stage. No cue. No signal. Just calling. And before stepping off, Steve turned around, smiled, and said one final line. Not for applause, but as a blessing. If you're still breathing, he said, God's not finished with you yet. Then they stepped off stage. But what they left behind had only just begun. Backstage, there were no producers giving instructions. No assistants rushing in with notes. Just quiet. Steve sat down not to rest, but to receive. He wiped his face slowly, not to erase the tears, but to remember what they cost. Keanu stood nearby, hands in his pockets, eyes calm but aware. You okay? He asked. Steve nodded. I'm more than okay. I'm different. Keanu sat beside him, both men now off camera, but more authentic than ever. You know what I realized out there? Steve said. I've been preaching and didn't even know it. Keanu smiled. That's the kind of preacher people actually listen to. They both laughed, this time without pain behind it. Just peace. And that message I gave back then? Steve said. The one that reached you? Keanu nodded. I needed to hear it again tonight too, Steve whispered. Maybe God sent you, to remind me. Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some truths are too big for language. Too holy for applause. Too eternal for a script. And so they sat there, two men who had carried grief, carried silence, and now carried purpose. Outside the studio, the world kept spinning. But inside millions of screens around the globe, one sentence echoed again and again. If you're still breathing, God's not finished with you yet.